myself. All right, welcome to the Wisconsin.net user group. We're going to have a great talk, .NET MAUI by Jesse Liberty. And without further ado, we'll start the presentation.
.NET MAUI for Xamarin.Forms programming. So who are you? My expectation is that you are comfortable with XAML and with C#, and very likely you have worked with Xamarin.Forms to some degree or other. Although if you're comfortable with XAML and C#, I think you'll find following this pretty straightforward. We're going to take a deep dive into a non-trivial application that I call Forget-Me-Not, and we'll look at that and see what it does, and then we're going to dive into the code. Quick few caveats. Forget-Me-Not is not complete, and there was no UI designer, so it's not very pretty. We're not going to review the API server database. We're going to take for granted that they exist and that they work, and you'll see them in use. So buckle up and get ready. We're going to dive right in. This is the application. As I said, it's called Forget-Me-Not. Navigation is through these 4 tabs. We're currently on the home page. We can click to the About page, and you'll see that this was written in XAML and C# with .NET MAUI by myself and Rodrigo Juarez. Rodrigo so far has been responsible for the back-end API, but we'll both be working on all of it. The entire concept and original design for this application was from my daughter, Robin Liberty, and we have used icons from Icon Scout. The premise of Forget-Me-Not is that you want to be able to exchange presents with your buddies. You start by going to the Preferences tab and filling in your preferences for these various categories. So I might come in here and say that my shirt size is extra large, that my pant size is, and we're going to click right here, 36, shoe size 11, and so forth, and I'll fill these in. Now, some of these may not relate to the way that I care about things, like what sports I watch. I can always come into a particular prompt and change it. So I'm going to change this to programming language. And now I can go over and put in what my favorite programming languages are. At any time, I can save what I've done. There's a save button at top and bottom, and when I do click save, I get a toast that my preferences were saved. In addition to my preferences, I have my list of buddies. I can add a buddy, and that will use the platform-specific share capability. On Android, I'm going to go ahead and click Gmail, and it's going to open up a mail message. I can fill in who I want to send it to. I can fill in a subject. Let's make that capital. Notice that there's some canned message here, but you can edit this or change this or delete this. And there will be a generated URL. Right now I'm just using the URL to my website, but what will be in here will be a one-time URL for creating a new account. We can just send that off. Back on the buddy list, we'll know the status of everybody we've sent an invitation to and who has accepted. If we click on someone who has accepted, we'll go to the details for that buddy, and we have 2 buttons. The first is to see that buddy's preferences. Just as we filled out ours, presumably he or she have filled out theirs. And here we see that Rodrigo has filled out all of these fields, including changing some of them to what he thought was most relevant. If I go back to my list of buddies, or more accurately, my buddy detail, I can click on occasions, and these are shared occasions that I want to remember, such as the anniversary of when we met and Rodrigo's birthday, the next date that's coming up, and how many days notice I would like. So I will be notified 14 days before July 4th that his birthday is coming up and then I might want to look at his preferences and get him a gift. I can also add additional occasions by putting in the name of the occasion, clicking on the date and using the date picker, putting in the number of days notice, and clicking save. That's pretty much the basics of Forget-Me-Not. Let's take a deep dive into how this is built. The right place to look is at the structure of a MAUI program. The first thing that we would do is add a couple NuGet packages. You'll notice that I have the community toolkit.maui and the community toolkit.mvvm installed. As far as I'm personally concerned, they are intrinsic to creating MAUI programs. Technically, that's not true, but I can't imagine writing a MAUI program without them. The next thing that I want to do as preparation is create a file called global usings, and in there I'm going to put my using statements that will be shared among all of my code. So I don't have to keep repeating these using statements. What I do need to do is use the keyword global before the using statement. And now these are available in every class. A couple other quick things to point out is that the resources file shares all of the resources for all of the platforms. So for example, in images, I create one image for all of the platforms, and MAUI will take care of the scaling and the distribution. So there's no longer creating your Android images and your iOS images and the multiple sizes. You just drop an image into the images folder, and MAUI takes care of the rest. The very first thing we're going to want to do is go from our main page to our About page. However, we also have a login page and a create account page, and we want to get that right as well. Let's turn to app.xaml.cs. Normally, out of the box, you would find that you are establishing that main page is equal to a new app shell, and we're going to talk about shell quite a bit. However, I want to go to my login, and so we're going to set main page equal to new login and use the login view model that is passed in to the app constructor. Now that's passed in through dependency injection. We're going to talk about that in some detail coming up. This is going to force the user to go to the login page before going to anything else in the application. Let's quickly walk through the login because a number of things in the login view model are going to be patterns used throughout the project. The very first thing I'm going to do is to declare a service, in this case account service, and if we come over to the services folder, we'll see that there are a number of services that we'll be using, all of which were written. They don't come for you, but they provide, in my case, access to the API. We're also going to create two properties, login name and password, and here is a huge departure from what we're used to in Xamarin.Forms, and this is because of the NuGet plugin on MVVM. We get what are called code generators. I could, as I have in the past, create the login name property by saying private string login name, public string login name, and then say get returns the private string and set sets the private string and calls the update. All of that is done for me by simply marking this as an observable property. I now have a property login name that is both a private string and I have access to a public login name just as if I had written it myself. In order to get observable property to work, I simply mark the class with the observable object attribute. Remember that you'll want all of your classes in MAUI to be marked as partial. Another significant change is how you handle commands. If we go to the login view, and we'll click on view and go to login XAML, you'll see that the button has a do create account command and a forgot password command, and the one we care about right now, the do login command. Unlike in Xamarin.Forms, we can again use code generation. We simply create the method that we want to implement that command and mark it with the attribute relay command. MAUI is smart enough that even though we called this doLogin command, it will look for a method called doLogin or doLogin async. We're now going to create a login request object, which simply takes the username and password. We'll go and get the account service for login and pass it that login request we just created, and that will log us in. We can then test to make sure that it worked by checking the isLoggedIn account service method, and assuming that it was, we're now ready to navigate to main page, and we'll use the line that would have been in our original file. That is, we're going to set main page to a new app shell. And then we're going to use app shell navigation, which you'll see throughout this application. There are 3 ways to use this. One is to call go to async and just give it the name of the page you want to go to. The second is to append string properties that you can pass into the page you're going to. And the third is to append a dictionary that holds an object you want to pass in, and we'll see those as we go. App shell navigation is accomplished through routing, and we can find those routes in app shell XAML CS. In here, we register all of the routes to all of the pages that we're interested in. When we route to the About page, that brings up About page XAML, and About page XAML CS will be the first thing that's hit. And in About page XAML.cs, we're going to have an About view model, which will be passed in by dependency injection. And then we're going to set the binding context as we would in a Xamarin.Forms application and initialize our components. The About view model is down here, and I tend to write a view model for each class. The About view model is going to use the utility service, and the utility service is going to allow us to get the API version. Let's go to the more interesting page, which is Preferences, and we navigate there using tabs. The tabs are declared in appshell.xaml, and as you can see, I've created a toolbar. And then for each tab, I have a shell content object that takes the title, that's what will be displayed, the template, which tells it where to go. In this case, it's going to main page. Here it's going to About, Preferences, the one we care about, and the icon that goes with it. When we click on the button for Preferences, we're going to go over to the page for Preferences, Preferences XAML, and Preferences XAML CS. And as we've seen before, we have a pattern. We're passing in the Preferences view model through dependency injection, setting the binding context. We also have a method here called save preferences. This is what's called when the view model saves the preferences. And that I've put in here just so it will call show toast. And show toast is what pops up on the bottom to tell you that, in fact, the object has been saved, your preferences have been saved. And this is pro forma. You can find in the documentation exactly how to do this, but we essentially set up the toast called toast.make and then toast.show, and we have a lot of control over font size and how long that toast appears for, and so on. One of the interesting things in preferences is that we're going to use styles. So we're going to style our entries to have a background color of antique white and so forth. However, we're also going to use the visual state groups so that we can turn that background to wheat when it has the focus. Visual state groups are not new in MAUI, although they are relatively new in Xamarin.Forms. So what this says is we're going to set a style whose type is entry. We're going to set a couple properties, and then we're going to set visual state groups. There are common states, and those common states include normal and focused. For normal, we're going to set a visual state setter of the background color being white. For focused, we're going to set a background color of wheat. We then come down and see a label that tells the user that they can fill in any preferences and they can change those preferences as they like. We have a save button and then a collection view. And the collection view consists of a collection of preferences where each preference has a preference prompt and a preference value. And these are saved bound to properties in the view model for preferences. Let's take a quick look at that. In the preferences view model, we have declared a list of preference objects called preferences. And notice we're using the observable property. Therefore, we do have the capital P preferences as a public property. The preference object itself is extremely straightforward and simple. It just says that it has two properties, preference prompt and preference value. And that's how we achieve that relationship. Preferences uses the preference service, and the preference service's job is to interact with the API. So we have get preferences, which we want to pull the user's preferences. This is not quite the same as the buddy's preferences. This is the current user's preferences. We set up our API client. We call get profile. We assign our response preferences to the result. And then we check to make sure that the response preferences is not null. And we iterate over those, setting preferences and adding them to a collection of preferences, which we return and then can bind to. Let's take a quick look at the buddy list XAML. Here we have a collection view that consists of a collection of buddies, which will be a list object in the view model. We have a specific buddy, which is the selected buddy, and we have a command that is invoked when that selection changes to pick a buddy. And then we have the display for the name and the status of that buddy. Let's go over to the view model for our buddy list. Here we have a property, the selected buddy. We're going to come back to that in a moment. As promised, we have a list of buddy objects. We have access to the buddy service. When we initialize, we're going to ask the buddy service to get us the buddies. And if we F12 to go into that, we see that the buddy service has a number of methods. And right now, I'm mocking up how we get the buddy and the buddy list and the buddy preferences. We will, of course, be doing that from the database. You'll remember that you can add a buddy. There are a couple ways to do that. Commented out is using canned email, but what we're doing is setting up our text and then calling share text. And share text uses the platform-specific sharing capability. And share text comes down here and uses the share object, which is built into MAUI, and sends in the share text request that we just created, passes in the text and a title for that. The one that we started down the path was buddy selection changed. Here, we want to use shell current go to async, and we want to go to the buddy detail page, but we want to pass in the selected buddy. Now, we could pass in the buddy's ID and create it on the buddy detail page. But in this case, what I'm going to do is pass in the entire selected buddy. The way I do that is I create a dictionary with a key and the object. I'm only going to have one entry this time in that dictionary. The key is going to be selected buddy, could be any string you like, and the value is going to be the selected buddy object itself. That is the buddy that was selected out of the list. When I get to buddy detail, I don't see anything special in the code behind, but if I go to the Buddy Detail View model, I have a new attribute called Query Property. It takes the name of the property that I want to attach the passed-in value to, and it takes a string indicating what was passed in as the key in this case. I'm going to be attaching this to selected buddy, which is down here, and I'm not using an observable property because there's quite a bit I want to do in the setter. The first thing I'm going to do is set my property in the traditional way. The next thing I'm going to do is to make some local properties, and these are the properties that we'll be binding to on the page. When we go to show the buddy preferences, once again we'll use the shell navigation, but this time instead of passing in a whole object, we just want to pass in the name. We do that not unlike the way you create URLs for the web. We put in the name of the page we're going to, a question mark, and then ID equal, and we use string interpolation to pick up the ID, double ampersand, buddy name equal, and interpolation for the name property. As you might expect, when we go over to the Buddy Preferences view model, we now have two query property attributes, one for each of the two properties that we sent in, and those map to properties of the class, where ID is mapping to the buddy ID, and we see that property at the bottom of the page, and buddy name is mapping to the property buddy name, which is declared as an observable property. Let's back up and take a quick look at the Create Account form. When you come to the login page, one of your options is Create Account. Clicking on that, you'll be prompted for your name, your email, and your password. This is the one place that I've put validation code. So when it's time to enter your name, it has to be at least 2 characters. When it's time to enter the email, it has to be a valid email. So if I say JL author, it's going to come back and say that's not a valid email. And notice it waited till I stopped typing. We'll say jlauthor@jlauthor.me. And now it's a valid email. And the password has to be at least 6 characters. And now we can create a new account. Let's take a look at that code. When we open up createaccount.xaml, we see that there's an entry, has a placeholder to enter your name, and then it has a behavior. This behavior, user stop typing behavior, comes directly out of the community toolkit. If we look at the documentation for the community toolkit, we can see that there are all sorts of things available, one of which is behaviors, and there are many behaviors available. The one we care about is user stopped typing behavior, and we get full documentation on how to use it in both XAML and C#. We get the properties, examples, and so forth. So let's go back and look at how we are using it. We say when the user has stopped typing, we want to call validate name command. And the threshold for indicating that they have stopped typing is ½ a second. That is 500 milliseconds. Of course, the validate name command is in the view model. So since we're in Create Account, we can go to Create Account View Model, come on down to the commands, and here's validate name. And it's pretty straightforward. We're going to set is validate name to true if we have greater than or equal to 2 characters, and then say show name error message to false. And we'll enable the button if we have all three of a valid name, a valid email, and a valid password. If the name is not valid, only one character, for example, we set the error message, we set is valid name to false, keeping the button disabled, and we set the show name error message to true, which will display the error. And the same thing is true for email. We're using a regex expression that I stole from somewhere off the net to make sure that we have a valid email. Throughout this, I've been talking about dependency injection. Dependency injection has a number of advantages. The strongest is that it is almost necessary for building good unit tests. The idea behind dependency injection is that we can inject the object, the real object, or when testing, we can inject a mock object that gives us control over the data that's going into that method. And we're using constructor injection throughout this project. The way you do that is you begin by setting up your dependency injection by registering the pages, view models, and services. Which brings us to MAUI program.cs. There is a MAUI program.cs in every MAUI project. Let's take it one step at a time. We begin by declaring a MAUI builder. We tell that builder to use MAUI app, which is our application, and use the MAUI community toolkit. We configure a few fonts, but now comes the interesting place. We're going to add to the builder services all of our pages, all of our services, and all of our view models. And that's going to allow MAUI's built-in inversion of control container to give us these as we need them without having to new up anything. Notice for the builder, you can add something as a transient or as a singleton. If you add it as a singleton, here I've made my API client a singleton, every time you request one, you'll get the same one. If you add it as a transient, then you'll get a new one each time you request it. Typically, I use add singleton for things that I'm going to go back to repeatedly and I know I'm going to need them again, such as the buddy service, and transient for things that I may or may not use in any particular run of the program. As an example of how to use this, let's go back to the buddy detail page and go to the code behind. Here we declare a buddy detail view model, and we have a constructor argument of type buddy detail view model. But nowhere in the code do we make a new buddy detail view model and call buddy detail with it. This is supplied to us by the inversion of control container built into MAUI because we registered it. And so when we come here and a buddy detail view model is needed, it is supplied, and any dependencies on the buddy detail view model are also created invisibly and with no programming effort on our part. Then I'm going to assign my local view model to the one that's passed in, set my binding context to that view model. And we do this in a number of places throughout the program. For example, in buddy preferences view model, we're creating a constructor, and in that constructor we're injecting a buddy preference view model object and then assigning it and using it from there. The advantage, as I suggested, is that when it's time to pass in this buddy preferences view model, I can make a mock using any of the mocking services and pass that in instead. That means that when there are places where the object that's passed in has to go out to something slow, like a service, we can use a mock to make it instant. And more important, in the mock, we can set up the data to have the values we want and then test that those values are coming through after whatever method is called or whatever other action we take. While there is an entire solution for the API, as far as we're concerned, all we care about is the API client class. As an example of how to use that, let's go look at account service, which is what's used for creating new accounts. We declare an object of type client, which we call API client. And that is passed in using dependency injection into the account service. Once we have that, we can create a new account by calling API client.createAccount and passing in an account create request object. Let's take a quick moment and look at what that is. An account create request object simply has the full name, email, and password of the new user. Once we instantiate an account create request, we can call API client.createAccount, pass it in, and the rest is taken care of for us. Sending back and forth the validation token, updating the database, and so forth is all hidden behind the curtain. It's worth noting that the database we've chosen to use is LightDB, as opposed to perhaps the more common choice of SQLite. With SQLite, we would have needed to set up a number of tables and relationships. LightDB is a NoSQL document-based object-oriented database that allows us to simply throw objects into the database, and then we can treat those as tables as necessary or as objects. Before I wrap up, let's look at a couple things that I haven't touched on yet that are very useful in creating MAUI applications. Let's assume that I'm concerned about the notch at the top of many iOS phones, iPhones. I want to create a platform-specific decision on managing that safe area. What I don't want to have to do is put in platform if-else statements. Let's go to the login page and add that. The first thing I'm going to do is go up to the content page and begin typing iOS : and then the specific platform-specific code I care about. In this case, page dot, and Microsoft comes up and Visual Studio comes up and offers me to include the page as a namespace. And that's a multiple choice, which one do I want? And I want the iOS specific page. So I'll choose that, and it puts in for me the necessary namespace. I can then come back and say page dot, and my page specific, iOS specific, comes up. And I'm going to choose use safe area. And it asks me, do I want to make that true or false? So you can see it really walks me through doing this. And that's all it took to create the use safe area platform-specific code. Before we stop, I want to point you to the excellent documentation for both the Community Toolkit and the Community MVVM Toolkit. Here I'm on the page for the Community Toolkit, and it tells you how to set up to use it, and then the various features of that toolkit, and they're quite extensive. For alerts, I can set up toast or a snack bar. There are a number of animations, a large number of behaviors, and many of these are behaviors that you would otherwise code yourself and have probably coded yourself again and again. Notice, by the way, that there's an email validation behavior. I could have used that to validate my email as well. And similarly, I could have used the required string validation behavior. We all write a lot of converters. If we go over to the converters section, you can see that the Community Toolbox offers a huge variety of converters. There are extensions, ways to manage images, layouts, and this can be very useful in terms of extending the layouts that are available to you. Views, which include an avatar view for adding avatars, which are essentially representations of the user, and the avatar view can be made aware of gravitars. Sometimes it's the small things that make all the difference, such as the support for a pop-up. The other page I want to make sure that you're comfortable with is the MVVM toolkit. Now, when you install the NuGet package, do not install the Microsoft MVVM toolkit. That has been deprecated. And instead you want the Community MVVM toolkit. That has support for the code generation that we looked at, as well as support for dependency injection. And you'll notice it says inversion of control, and here you can read about how the inversion of control works within MAUI. In addition to the documentation, I have 2 different series on my blog post at jesseliberty.com and a series of interviews about MAUI with some of the principals from Microsoft on my podcast. You may very well also want to look at other videos that have been created by James Montemagno and others at Microsoft. There's quite a lot out there about MAUI.
All right, that looks like the presentation is done. I guess we'll start with question and answers. So is there any questions in the room here regarding this? And Jesse, can you hear me?
I can.
Awesome. Yes, we have a question. Okay, I'll repeat the question just in case you couldn't hear. Do you still need a separate project for the different platforms, like Android or iOS, or does it cover the question good?
Yes, you you will create. It will create for you when you create the solution. It'll create the necessary projects, but it's typically it's all in one. Is that right? Let me. You would think I would know that right off the top of my head, but let me just double check what I just said while you ask me the next question.
Sure. We have another question about it. Is there any source code available where we can find more information about this particular implementation?
Yes, that was on the last slide, and I can email that to you, or we can
Sure.
if we back up, or I can go get that for you. In terms of the first question, no. If I look at this project, it's one project in the solution. There's no differentiation between the iOS and Android as separate projects. And then to answer your second question about the source code, let me get you that. That'll take me just a second to get you the address for that. Why don't we go on to the next question, and meanwhile I will find that slide for you.
Of course. So we have another question that talks about. Let's do the next one. Do you have any books that you can recommend that cover MAUI?
Well, I have a book coming out the beginning of April through Packet, which will be called .NET MAUI for C# developers. I don't know that there are any others that are out already.
There's a question that talked about, I noticed you were using Visual Studio. Does the same thing work in Writer or Apple devices?
I haven't tried Writer. You can hear me all right, though, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I haven't tried Writer. There is Visual Studio for Mac, and in theory, everything that I did today you can do there as well.
Sure. And a follow-on question be, what about Visual Studio Code?
You can write in Visual Studio Code, but you're not going to get the same level of support from MAUI as you would in Visual Studio.
Perfect. I think we have one more question. I'll show that one as well.
Question.
Were there any reason to hesitate on converting a larger enterprise scale Xamarin application to .NET MAUI?
Well, we're converting it where I work. We're converting a very large application over, and the biggest hesitation is if you have extensive use of custom controls. There's some work involved in migrating those, but to some degree, we felt like there really isn't much chance because Microsoft is going to stop supporting .NET MAUI, I believe, in November. So to me, it didn't make any sense not to begin that process. Let me see. Let me just see if I can find you the slide you're asking for where the code is. Well,
sure. And I can also post this later on as a discussion comment, so we'll get that there too.
Okay, that'll be great.
Yeah.
I do have it. How do I show it to you?
If you share your screen with it showing,
yeah, that should work.
Make that visible.
Okay, let's see. Present. Hello. Hi, this is Jesse Liberty.
Don't do that.
This presentation is .NET MAUI
Stop that.
for
Make it go away.
Xamarin.Forms program. So who are you?
There we go. Make that go away. And see if we can present share screen. Share screen. And I don't want any of what they're saying to share.
It should be plugged in.
You would think. Select tab to preview. No. Okay, I'm not sure how to get this to you. The address is github.com. And then under that, you'll look for my name, Jesse Liberty. And this code is under the name Granite State Forget-Me-Not. All one word. And if we... this will work. If I can just bring this over to
I'll have my screen set up to share properly.
How about that? Can you see that?
Yes, we can see that.
Great.
Perfect. Thank you. Jesse, you mentioned something about something being deprecated at some point. Well, can you repeat what that was?
No, what I said was that Microsoft is no longer going to support Xamarin.Forms in favor of MAUI. And that happens, I believe, in November of 23. So not that long from now.
Sure. Okay. Any other questions that we have in the room? Yes. So the question was, how's the support for like Bluetooth and other hardware specific devices?
And that falls under, I don't know, but I would go look on Microsoft Learn. I'm sure that there's documentation on that. I haven't worked with that in MAUI.
Sure. Okay, I think I can put this on the screen. We have a comment about someone live looking up the answer for us. So thank you very much, Greg.
I had it a little early.
So we've got a year from May.
Right, you've got 1 year. There you go.
Anything else? Otherwise, we'll wrap this up.
Accurate.
Yes.
I'm kind of curious. What's the these controls? Why does it look kind of like native iOS and Android controls, or how it kind of different look like that?
Yeah. So the question was around, how do the controls look? Does it look native to the platform they're on?
Yeah, well, just as with Xamarin.Forms, you can have it put out native controls that will look platform specific. That's sort of the default. Or you can take control over the look and feel and make the application look the same across platforms. And the original trend was to make them very native looking,
So an iOS app look like an iOS app, and you can certainly still do that. That's sort of the default. But more and more applications you're seeing look the same on iOS and Android and on Mac OS and so forth. And that's really a design question, but it will support either approach.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, maybe this falls outside. Talk about what are the steps?
I can't hear the question, so you'll have to repeat them.
I'll repeat the question. Yes. So what are the steps to deploy this Maui application to particular app stores?
It's pretty much the same as you saw in Xamarin.Forms. So you're going to go into production mode, and with iOS, you're going to need to have a developer account so that you can provision your release. And with Google, I believe if you go into production, that it's easy. It's certainly easier to get it into the Play Store, but I know they've added some complications recently. So again, I would check. I would not depend on me for the specifics because I work on enterprise apps, but I believe getting that into the store is pretty straightforward on the Google Play side, and I don't know about the Mac or Windows stores. I know that all of them can be done.
Okay. Very good. Is there any other questions that we have online or in person? All right.
I can't believe I don't have a slide for my book. That's just distressing. But it's from Packet.
If you
and
ping it
comes
to
out
me, I'll
April
send
1st.
it out to the group so everyone can get an opportunity to find more information about Maui. So
Thank you so much. I appreciate
you're
that.
welcome. So, well, that's a wrap. So thank you for speaking on the topic, and I look forward to the next month. So thank you.
Thank you. You probably can't see me, but I'm waving. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care.